right, at the end of the last lecture, the computer kind of crashed and got unplugged and didn't record things, and so that's why the recording itself looks like it was longer, because then I went ahead and was able to retrieve the recording, and then I added in the notes that I verbally had said to you guys out loud as far as the reflex activity. So we have on spinal reflexes, we had somatic, autonomic. Somatic had 5 components. Autonomic has 6 components. We're going to be talking more about autonomic starting today, which is chapter 15. And we talked about the 5 components of receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and effector. And then we went on to talk about what does the stretch reflex look like, and that was the left side of the picture. So that was this component of the picture. Then we talked about the flexor reflex, which is on the right side of the picture, my second arrow right there. And that was the example of the hot pot. So you would, yank your hand back, thus flexing your arm. That's why it's called the flexor reflex. And then we have a tendon reflex, which uses the Golgi tendon organs, preventing the tendon from stretching too much. And then we had a crossed extensor reflex, which is incorporates part of the flexor reflex, because when you step on something, you yank that foot out of the way, but you got to have the other side of the spinal cord respond so that you can put weight on the opposite side of the lower extremity. So notes are in there. Do you guys go back, and you guys saw it on the recording where you could write it back down if you needed to? Did you guys try looking at the recording so that you could do that? But it's there for anybody who did try?
Yeah, I had to watch it. It was all there.
All right, it's all there. So go on to the end of the last recording. Just fast forward to the end of it, and then you'll see me. I have it recording while I'm writing it out, and I verbally said it out loud so that way, because I obviously had terrible handwriting. It was all crooked and sideways. The pen was having problems writing sideways. It was just, this computer system is a mess, and they fixed it, and apparently it's not fixed. All right, so you guys picked that up on the end of the last recording. Going on to chapter 15, the autonomic nervous system. All right, so in the last chapter we talked about somatic nervous system. What is the effector for somatic? Skeletal muscle. And what is the effectors for autonomic? Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and the glands. No skeletal muscle with autonomic. So remember, autonomic is like automatic. You don't consciously think about it, but your heart keeps beating, glands are secreting, that type of thing. Okay, but when you want to move your skeletal muscle, you say, I want to do this, but it goes much faster than that, and then you can pick something up and do it. So that's why that's somatic. Everything else is autonomic. So let's see. Afferent pathways, another name for that is ascending, and it's the sensory side of it. It's going to the CNS, right? So from a sensory receptor to the CNS. Efferent pathways are descending pathways. They're going from your CNS to, if it were somatic, it would be going to a skeletal muscle. If it's autonomic, it's going to go to the cardiac, smooth, and glands, right? Okay. So another thing to remember with somatic was that there was just one neuron from the spinal cord to the effector or the skeletal muscle, right? So we drew a more simple picture. We went through that pathway. Then we started adding to that picture last time, and we're going to add a lot more to that picture today. So what I would suggest is between, today and tomorrow, focus on your lab practical. I get that. Yes, do that. Then, this weekend, go back to those pictures and start drawing them out. So that way when it comes to exam 5, you can quickly on the very front or back of your packet redraw out your spinal cord with the dorsal and ventral rami, your dorsal root ganglia, all those things that we started talking about, and the things that we're going to add to that picture today. You'll be able to draw one large picture, and then you can go back and refer to it when you get to those questions on the exam. Because seriously, a picture's worth 1,000 words. That way you don't have to write all these different things out. You'll know it just by the direction of your arrows and where you're putting your neuron cell bodies and things like that. So with the autonomic nervous system, automatic effectors, we talked about that. So we're going to learn for autonomic that there are two motor neurons from the spinal cord to the effector. So somatic had one, autonomic has two motor neurons. Okay, there's a difference right there. So another thing that I hope you guys are kind of getting with my slightly subtle wink, wink, nudge, nudge hints, I would probably, after you get done with this material, or after Tuesday's lecture, the last part of the lecture, I would probably make a column for somatic and a column for autonomic. And things that are the same, you only have to study for it once, and then you'll just know it's the same for this as it is for that one. But the things that are different, those are the parts that you want to kind of focus on and put like a little star by it and memorize this is only for autonomic, or this is only true for somatic. Okay, so start creating like a little chart like that. And somatic and autonomic have similar afferent pathways that we're going to redraw in a second. And the efferent pathways, or the output pathways, have similarities, but there are some important differences. So the nice thing is there are a lot of things that aren't too different. That's why we start with the more basic picture and we just add to it. Because if you guys get that basic picture under your belt, it's easier to add the extra components then. So those efferent or output pathways are going to be called motor pathways. And even when the effector is a gland, we're still going to call it a motor pathway because it falls into the same category. So just think, if it's efferent, it's a motor pathway on autonomic. Doesn't matter if I'm saying gland or smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, okay? And instead of the one neuron, which was in somatic, good, okay, we're going to have two for autonomic. And in somatic, it was just the one neuron cell body left the, do you guys remember whether it was a dorsal or ventral horn? It left the ventral horn on the spinal cord and exited out the ventral ramus to the effector, and because it was somatic, it went to a skeletal muscle. And you guys are seeing I'm repeating myself like 5 million times, but if you guys repeat it 5 million times, you'll get it under your belt too. Now, with autonomic, you're going to have two. So the first one will leave the spinal cord, but it will go to a ganglion. What other ganglion have we learned about? The dorsal root ganglion. Now that is on the sensory side, so that's not the ganglion we're going to be going to. Okay, and that was a unipolar neuron in there, cell body that resided there, right? Okay, and there was no synapse there. Okay, the information just kind of traveled and went through there, right? And the cell body resided there. With the ANS, autonomic nervous system, we have our neuron cell body that resides in the spinal cord. It exits through the ventral root, or not the ventral root yet. It exits and it's going to go to a ganglion where it will do a synapse. Now sometimes it will synapse in the first ganglion it goes through, and sometimes it'll bypass, it'll go through it but not synapse there, it'll synapse in a later ganglion. And then it will finally exit. So when it synapses, that means now we're talking about the second neuron. Okay? So the second neuron then would exit and go out to its effector, cardiac, smooth, or gland. Okay? So, somatic motor neuron goes, cell body is in the ventral horn. Okay? Autonomic, it's going to be in the I haven't told it to you yet. It'll be lateral horn. But I will come to that in a moment. So it won't be from the ventral horn on autonomic. It will be from a lateral horn, which exits the spinal cord. And we're going to have names that we're going to use here that you guys are seeing. So autonomic motor pathways consists of the two motor neurons from the cord to the effector. So they're saying cord to a ganglion, then ganglion to an effector. Those are your two motor neurons. The first motor neuron is going to be called the preganglionic neuron. Pre because it's first, not so much before, but just first. That means the cell body is in the CNS, and we're going to learn that it's going to be in the lateral horn for the most part. And we learned about our dorsal, lateral, and ventral horns before. But we didn't talk a lot about lateral yet because we hadn't built onto that story. And then that guy will go to a ganglion, where he will synapse with the second neuron, which will be the postganglionic neuron. So sometimes you might hear first neuron and second neuron, and that's regarding first neuron is also meaning the preganglionic neuron, second is meaning the postganglionic neuron. Post usually means after, but that's where some of the terminology gets confusing. So just know you have two, and you're going to have to memorize the first neuron is preganglionic, the second neuron is called postganglionic. Okay, and those are our motor neurons exiting. So let's see, what else do I need to tell you? We talked about the synapsing or not. Awesome, awesome. So preganglionic, we're going to write cell body in the CNS. The axon goes to a ganglion. Okay, the postganglionic neuron, the cell body is in the ganglion, and because it's outside of the spinal cord, it means it's PNS, right? Peripheral nervous system. Okay? So that's why it's saying PNS there. Its axon extends to the effector. Okay? So, if the, I'll come back to that. All right, what else do I want to tell you first? Okay, so let's go down to autonomic ganglia. They are motor and more complex than the sensory. So sensory was like our most simple, easiest way to look at things. When you guys were looking at like a reflex, for the most part, most of them were really quick and easy, right? They didn't even go and communicate up to the brain itself. They just communicated, yes, it was in the CNS because they had an interneuron in the spinal cord, but it didn't have to travel up or down the spinal cord at all. Now we're going to talk about how we end up also traveling a little bit above and below the segment that we're at. So autonomic ganglia are motor and more complex than sensory. Let's see. Outer CT capsule, because anything that is part of the PNS has a CT wrapper, correct? So that's why it has an outer CT capsule. Synapses between the pre and the postganglionic cells. So that's talking about these two guys right here. There's a synapse between the two of them. And we didn't have that because we didn't have two motor neurons in somatic. This is why this is a little unique with autonomic. So motor neuron 1 is going to synapse with motor neuron 2. We also have fibers. And what do you think another name for fibers is? Axon. Okay? So fibers mean an axon. It can pass through without synapsing. So that's where I said it might go through that first ganglion and not synapse there, but go on to a second or third ganglion and synapse there finally. So that's why it's saying it may or may not synapse. It will eventually synapse, it just doesn't mean it's the first one that it enters into. And let's see. So let's go on to neurotransmitters. We know from before, I forget if it was up for exam 3 material or 4, but we talked about how they could be excitatory or inhibitory, correct? And then also we talked about things like EPSPs and IPSPs. This is kind of the same thing. If you drip a little bit, you get more EPSPs, excitatory postsynaptic potentials. If you have a different neurotransmitter, it might do an IPSP, which is still stimulating, but in effect, it's really sending out signals that inhibit you from getting closer to threshold, correct? Okay, so sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So on here, you guys will see me do sympathetic. Sometimes I'll write symp, and parasympathetic, I usually will do a P/S for parasympathetic. And when it comes to neurotransmitters, the reason that we say it could be excitatory or inhibitory, the other thing you guys learned about in exam 3 or 4 was that it depended on the location, okay, also. Because we saw like acetylcholine had multiple ways that it could be used, and depending on the location that you found it, depended on whether it was stimulatory or inhibitory also. So if you guys don't remember that, go back to those notes and review them a little bit because it will help you with the current stuff. So we're talking about, if we're talking about with the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and we're talking about ANS, autonomic nervous system, the glands that these guys are affecting that we're talking about have to do with smooth muscle, cardiac, or the glands, okay? So with sympathetic, the one that we see often is epinephrine or norepinephrine. So you'll see me write that sometimes as E or NE for shorthand, okay? And another similar neurotransmitter that you'll see is adrenaline, right? So what's our sympathetic nervous system do for us? Fight or flight, right? Fight or flight. So it makes sense that epinephrine, norepinephrine, adrenaline, will really amp you up so that you can run away from the bear or the moose or whatever else is coming after you, right? Okay. Or go after it if you're trying to hunt it down, I guess. Either way, I'm okay. You just don't want to be its meal, right? Okay. And when it comes to parasympathetic, this one, you guys know ACH is acetylcholine, right? So that's important as well. So these are talking about where they're going to the effectors, okay? We're going to talk about towards the end of this lecture about what the neurotransmitters are in between the synapses between the pre- and postganglionic neuron. And it's a little different. So when we talked about epinephrine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine, you guys always saw it at the end, like the neuromuscular junction when it was skeletal muscle, or we were seeing it at the end when we're talking about the glands, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, that type of thing when it was autonomic. So both sympathetic and parasympathetic wires are going to the heart, for example, okay? But it just depends on who is going to be more dominant at the time. They're both working, okay? But it's the difference between, so for example, it's not like your sympathetic is completely shut off right now. It's in the background in case you need it. Sympathetic is like your emergency system, right? Keeps you alive. So if all of a sudden the fire alarm went off, then your sympathetic would dominate all of a sudden. Because you got a loud noise, something's going on, it's an emergency, you either have to get out of here or you got to figure out what's going on, that would take over. Parasympathetic doesn't turn off, it just goes in the background at that time. Because do you guys need to be producing urine when you need to run away from the bear? Do you need to digest your food when you need to hide from the bear that's trying to eat you? Do you need to produce urine or have a slower heart rate or digest your food if you are chasing that bear because you want to make it your meal today? No. So that is the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic, okay? So depending on where you're at in the location, so for example in the GI tract, okay, the parasympathetic is your rest digest, right? So it is working and digesting your food, but then all of a sudden, let's say that fire alarm went off, it would let the sympathetic override it and take over, because that's more important to save your life at that moment than it would be to continue to digest that meal from lunch today, okay? So parasympathetic can't ever really override sympathetic, right? You need that emergency system for survival. So parasympathetic will never override it, but it can be dominant at the time because that's the processes you need going on in the body at that moment. So with the ANS divisions, both are active at all times, parasympathetic and sympathetic. It's just the activity of one will dominate over the other. So activity of one will dominate over the other. Okay. So with, let's see, Sherry likes to use the example of like a piano player. So both hands could be playing the piano at the same time, but sometimes one's playing more the melody and one's playing the background, right? But they're both going on. And maybe one's more important, so you're getting louder with one hand while the other hand still is a little quieter on the keyboard, and sometimes it flips and you got to do it the other way. So think of it like a piano player. They both are on, it's just which one is more important at that time and what would you be utilizing or using. So what else do we want to say? You guys already know parasympathetic is rest digest. You guys know sympathetic is fight or flight. And let's see, so with the ANS anatomy, so autonomic nervous system anatomy. First we're going to look at parasympathetic. It's a more simple circuit, and it's an easier one to look at. So the other name for parasympathetic is the cranial sacral division. Okay, so cranio implies what to you guys? The head, right? Brain, cerebrum, right? So CNS. And sacral, think like the sacral bone, right? Down at the bottom. All right, so that's why cranial is talking about brainstem, sacral is talking about the sacral region of the SC is spinal cord. So because this is where neuron number 1 is residing, okay, which is in the brainstem area, and we said preganglionic is in the CNS, correct? Okay, so that's why we were talking about that. So preganglionic cell body lives in the CNS. Postganglionic cell body, it says, is in the terminal ganglion. Do you guys know what terminal means? Kind of like the terminal branches. Where were the terminal branches located? At the end, right? Or you could think like Walking Dead, terminus. Nobody wanted to stay there. That was the end of the line for some people. All right, so terminal ganglion means the end part, right? So postganglionic cell bodies in the terminal ganglion located in or near the visceral organ. Okay, visceral, you guys know, means like organ itself, so visceral organ. So knowing that, okay, which one do you think is the longer axon? A preganglionic cell body or a postganglionic cell body?
Post.
Why post? No, we're going from the CNS out because we're on the efferent side.
Or other way around.
So keep thinking about it though. So you have preganglionic in the brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord, and it has to go out, and it doesn't synapse until it makes it to the postganglionic. That's who he's synapsing with, right? He's synapsing, and it says postganglionic cell body is in the terminal ganglion located in or near the organ. If the cell body is near the organ, it's farther away from the CNS, it's closer to the organ side. So who has the longer axon? Preganglionic would. Okay? Preganglionic would. I know it seems opposite, but when you take it apart like that, then it starts to make sense why it would be longer at that point. Which is why I ask you guys, because I know that it would be confusing if you all of a sudden see that on an exam and you're like, what is she talking about? Of course it's this way. And I'm like, no, we pointed it out. Now you guys know. Now you guys can follow it. So let's see. So pathway, it says, preganglionic axons enter either, because if we're talking about the brainstem side of it, cranial nerves, okay? And if we're talking about the sacral region side of it, we are talking about what are called pelvic splanchnic nerve. Now, this is where you guys have to make like those charts, you know, also to keep sympathetic and parasympathetic separate and remember what's going on. The weird thing about this is, here I am telling you that the parasympathetic is in charge of an area that is the cranio and sacral area. So those are at like the top and the bottom of your spinal cord, if you will, right? And I'm going to show you guys in a minute that the sympathetic is like in the middle of the body. So a lot of things on us are fairly symmetrical, right to left. We have a right arm and a left arm, and you know, your bones are symmetrical for the most part on how they look. But as you guys get into 228, you start to realize some of our internal things are not very symmetrical. Like your heart's not really directly in the center, and it kind of angles in a certain way. And the right and the left side of the heart aren't identical either. Even your right and your left lungs are not identical with their lobes. So it gets kind of different and complicated when you get inside the body. But basically, this is kind of weird though. Cranial at the top and sacral at the bottom is parasympathetic. And then sympathetic is going to be in the central part, what we'll call the thoracodorsal in a little bit. So that's down here, thoracal. This pen is writing over it. I'll fix that in a minute. So I meant to write under it. So the other thing that you want to keep in mind, you will learn that there are other nerves called just splanchnic nerves. And those are sympathetic. This is a pelvic splanchnic, which is parasympathetic. So one way to remember that is you have P for pelvic and S for splanchnic, and that goes along with P/S for parasympathetic. That's one way you can remember that pelvic splanchnic are parasympathetic versus just splanchnic nerves are sympathetic. Splanchnic. That is a crazy word, right? Splanchnic. Okay? All right, so let's see. All right, and splanchnic just means viscera, essentially. So it does make sense once you know why that term is used for higher up. And you're going to see why we separate some of these things as cranial nerves and pelvic splanchnic nerves are under parasympathetic. And they synapse with the postganglionic neuron, again, in the terminal ganglion, which we mentioned with postganglionic cell body up above. So we look at cranial outflow, the ones that are definitely under parasympathetic control. We have cranial nerve 3. Do you guys remember what its name was? Aside from the Roman numeral, it was oculomotor. And then we have 7 is facial. And then 9, you guys know what 9 is? Glossopharyngeal, thank you. And then we have the last one, X marks the spot. Vagus, baby. All right, vagus. So vagus is actually really extremely important, more so than you guys have realized before. And part of it is because vagus accounts for 90% of all parasympathetic output. 90%. So vagus accounts for 90% of all parasympathetic output. It does a lot of stuff. Remember, vagus was the only one that wasn't just in the head and neck. It went to other parts of the body as well. And now you know why it is so important for the rest of your body and why it goes below. This is part of it. So cranial nerve 10, or vagus nerve, is coming out of the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. It is outside of your spinal cord, okay? It also contributes to 3 major plexuses. So I only wanted you guys to know about some of the other major, like brachial plexus and things like that from the previous set of notes. Just know that there are other plexi or plexuses to know. In this case, vagus contributes to cardiac, pulmonary, and esophageal. So cardiac, you guys know, means heart. That makes sense. Pulmonary means lung. And esophageal is talking about like the esophagus. Okay? So this is important for all of those things. And then it says, and those are because that is above the, these 3 are above the diaphragm. And it says when a main trunk of the vagus reaches the esophagus, it branches off into an anterior and posterior trunks, and then into, here's some more plexi, aortic plexus, to nearly all internal organs. And so what it's talking about is after the esophagus goes below the diaphragm, this is an area below the diaphragm. Okay, so we had 3 that are above and 1 below that the vagus nerve is extremely important to. Let's see, and so if we're talking about internal organs, you're talking about abdominal, right? For most of those guys below the diaphragm. So when we say that it serves or innervates these areas, we're talking about parasympathetic tone to most of your abdominal viscera. And remember, plexi are where they exit the spine and then they converge and kind of look like they meet up, and then they diverge, and sometimes they converge and diverge again, or other branches are coming together. So a plexus will look kind of like tangled up fishing line, but it's actually very specific in the way that they are converging and diverging. As far as sacral flow, so this is the lower part of parasympathetic, of the cranial sacral division, if you will. This is through the pelvic splanchnic, so the P/S for parasympathetic, pelvic splanchnic, you're just going to have to memorize, means parasympathetic. Those nerves to the lower abdominal organs associated with the pelvis. So what organs do you guys think are associated with the pelvic splanchnic, the sacral output of parasympathetic? Maybe that were lower. Bladder. Bless you. How about reproductive? I'll just put repro for reproductive. And also rectum. We really get to talk a lot about that in 228, just so you know. Everybody loves talking about poop, right? So, if, for example, you had a spinal cord injury, right? And would it end up affecting cranial nerve 10? If something just, you had a transection and injury to a spinal cord level in the cervical spine, would it affect vagus nerve? That's right. I said it wasn't, the nerve exits, because it's a cranial nerve, it exited up off the CNS, off the brain part, well, off of the medulla oblongata, right? So it exited off of there. It is not in the spinal cord, it's outside of it, outside of the bony spinal column. So if something happened in the spinal cord itself, will it affect these things here that we talked about for parasympathetic? It shouldn't, correct? Unless maybe somebody cuts your whole head off, like Marie Antoinette or something. Then you have a whole host of other problems. You're probably not alive at that point, so it really wouldn't matter. But that is why you could still have other things functioning internally as far as the cranial part and the sacral outflow part of it, correct? Did I say that right? No. The cranial part would be fine because it exited up there. What about the sacral part of the it would not be okay because that is the spinal cord. I tried to trick you. You guys went with me on that rabbit hole. Just kidding. All right, so vagus, cranial nerve 10 coming out of the cranial part would not have been affected if you had a transection of the spinal cord because it's not in the spinal cord. However, when you're talking about the sacral outflow part, that is the spinal cord. So if something happened, it could potentially affect that area, depending on where the transection is, right? So let's see, what do I want to tell you? So parasympathetic activity would remain intact for the most part with the vagus nerve, but the pelvic splanchnic, because it's the sacral part, would lose a little bit of its parasympathetic activity to the sacral portion of the spinal cord that receives ANS, or autonomic nervous system, information or control from your, do you guys remember who controls this? Who's our control person? Hypothalamus, okay? So you'd lose some sacral control of the parasympathetic, but for the most part, you're not doing too bad. Let's see. And that is why somebody could be a paraplegic, and it wouldn't necessarily affect their bladder control, but if they're a quadriplegic, potentially, right? Just depends where the injury occurs. Let's see, what else? What do you guys want to talk about? How about the sympathetic division? All right, I'm going to fix my line here because I drew over it. So we said parasympathetic was the craniosacral, sympathetic is the thoracolumbar, okay? All right, so once a preganglionic axon reaches a paravertebral ganglion, there are several possibilities that can happen. So let's talk a little bit about the pictures we had so that that sentence will make more sense. So first, let's draw just a our spinal cord right here. And let's put in our horns. And I'm going to add a little bump out here. Pretend it's symmetrical, all right? Now, you guys know that back here was your dorsal horn because this was our dorsal side. Here's our ventral side. So then you know that this is the ventral horn. And now you guys know that this is the lateral horn sticking off to the side there, okay? And the thoracolumbar division is where the lateral horns are located. So you don't have that extra bump out to the side in the cervical cord or segments, okay? You don't see that extra side bump out until you're in the thoracic and lumbar area, okay? So dorsal horn is where our sensory neurons synapsed with our interneurons, right? We know that. The ventral horn is where our motor neurons lived, right? The neuron cell bodies live there, and then they exited out. The lateral horns are in the thoracolumbar part of the spinal cord, which is where our sympathetic neuron cell bodies live. So sympathetic has everything to do with thoracolumbar, and this is where then your preganglionic neuron, neuron number 1, motor neuron number 1, lives. So this is where his cell body would live right there, okay, when we make our connections in a moment. So, and then we could have, coming off of here, you have your dorsal root ganglion. We'll do our little, that guy, and our little bump out here, and we'll come in here, and we'll do this. And remember, it's, if you had your sensory receptor, it would come in this way. Here is your dorsal root ganglion, there is your unipolar, so no synapses occurring there, and then he continues to the dorsal horn where he would have maybe synapsed with an interneuron. In this case, if we didn't synapse there, maybe we go right to this guy down here, and we would synapse with him maybe, okay? Or we might do an interneuron, or we might do one of those neurons that goes up, higher up in the CNS, up to the like primary motor cortex, and then it might come back down and then tell this exiting guy what to do. But this guy right here, I'll do him in, let's do him in red. Okay, this guy right here is sympathetic, and this is where he resides, okay? So everything starts in the CNS first, and you will either synapse with a postganglionic neuron. So first ganglion will either go directly to the secondary one, or you will ascend or descend. You will go up a level or two or down a level or two and to another ganglion in the chain. So you can skip one, like we said, and then synapse to a postganglionic neuron in a different ganglion, okay? So let's see, sympathetic thoracolumbar division, that's our lateral horns. And let's see, once a preganglionic axon reaches the paravertebral ganglion, there are several possibilities. So we're going to add to our picture here. Let me erase this guy for a second. All right, and we're going to add to the picture. And what I'm going to do here is, as I come off of here, I'm going to have two other pathways here. And this circular guy here is going to be our ganglion. I'm leaving an open spot there, but for now, if you want to pretend like that's a closed circle, you can. And so what happens here is the sensory one went in. Here's our, we're just going to talk about the guy coming out, and I'll leave him with the red color for a second so you can see primary I'll do with red, post I'll end up doing in another color. So what he does is, this is where his neuron cell body resides. He's going to leave the spinal cord. He's going to come across our ventral root. He's going to come over here, and you actually skip the first pathway, and you go into this second pathway right here. And if you were going to synapse in this first ganglion, you would, I'll draw the synapse this time first. And let's say now we are going to be our second, or the postganglionic neuron. His cell body would reside in this ganglion, and then he would go out that second pathway and travel down to the effector. Okay? So the first pathway that I drew, I'll put it in blue here, that is actually called your white rami communicans, which you guys will see in a second. I think it's written, there it is, white ramus and gray ramus. So the first one is the white ramus, and that's always in, never out. White is in, okay? And then the gray ramus is always out. So it's a one direction gate there, okay? So for a somatic reflex, this was the previous stuff, not autonomic, this is review. So for the somatic reflex, like the knee jerk or a simple reflex, you would have your somatic sensory receptor. It would go into the spinal cord through the afferent pathway. It would go into the DRG, or dorsal root ganglion. It would synapse in the dorsal horn, correct? And then with the somatic reflex, you might have an interneuron, which would then synapse to the ventral horn, and then the which was in the gray matter of your spinal cord, right? And then the axon would leave through the ventral root and go out to a somatic effector. And who's our somatic effectors? Skeletal muscle, okay? And with skeletal muscle, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And then we'll come back to those guys in just a minute. For the sympathetic division, so now it's coming back to what we just drew a second ago. Okay, this is thoracolumbar, and we will have a visceral sensory receptor. So you still have something coming in. I'll just draw it in blue right here. So I'll put sensory receptor. It still comes in just like it did on somatic. It's still going to go up to your DRG. Pretend like my lines are connected. And it's going to come in here. Okay, so it had the unipolar cell body in the DRG, just like somatic did. It also synapses with an interneuron, but it's going to synapse at the, where? Lateral horn. Then it's going to follow the efferent or motor pathway, so it goes out the ventral root, past and into the ventral ramus, and it will go to the second entrance, okay, not the first, the second little pathway there, which this guy right here, this ganglion that I drew, is called a paravertebral ganglion. Paravertebral ganglion. And para kind of means to the side, so it's not directly in front of the spinal cord, it's a little bit off to the side, okay? Then the second entrance, called the white ramus communicans, the inside, okay? So this is like the on-ramp to a freeway, only one way on, you can't go the wrong way on a freeway, okay? And it will synapse there, but not always. So in this example, I did draw the synapse in the first ganglion that it came to. And so that's the paravertebral ganglion, and it always goes out the gray ramus communicans. So this is the off-ramp of the freeway, okay? So only one way off. And then it will go through the ventral ramus, and this is where we're green and we're coming out, and it will finally synapse with a visceral effector. So that effector would have been your, I'm going to write it in green, would either have been heart, so cardiac, smooth muscle, or your glands, right? Okay? Because we're talking about autonomic. So this is just one pathway that could occur. Now we're going to add more to the picture, and we're going to add what's called the sympathetic trunk. So this is going to add another leg, and this would be technically above or below this level. Okay, so think about where you're moving vertical or descending on the vertical axis. So this is going up or down, but I'm going to draw it below, but I want you guys to think this is like on top of another. And think of the spinal cord as having been continuous. But you would have another black. Okay. So then you could have another one here, pretend everything is the same size. Just draw it real quick. This guy would also still have a dorsal root ganglion, another little guy coming off. He goes off this way. Okay. We come down here, and remember we have our so I'm going to draw it another color just so that you can see it over this. So let's do green for a second. So we could have a connection here that would go from this guy to this guy over here. So pretend like there's a nerve connecting those two guys there, okay? Here, no, not through the gates. Let me draw it off to the side so I don't confuse you guys. Sorry. Let me draw it. I'll just leave it in black. But it would be like this guy might have a connection over this way to here, to this guy. Okay? So think of like another little offshoot that the axons can travel through. No, don't think of it like the plexus.
Just another pathway.
It's another pathway that axons will be able to go through, and it's above and below. So that this is where things are outside of the spinal cord, but the axons are going to go up or down along this area is what it is. So it literally might just go up a segment or two and then decide that it's going to, so what will happen, I'm going to erase my green one. Oh, helps if I actually erase it. So I'll erase this guy, and instead of the synapse right there, so I'm going to continue with the red. Okay, so let's say he left the lateral horn, he goes into the paravertebral ganglion in the white rami communicans, okay? But let's say he decides not to synapse in that ganglion. He's going to ascend maybe a level or two. So he will go down this other pathway and come into here, and he will then synapse maybe here. So now I'll draw my green guy here. And again, he only can exit through the gray, but he's not going to exit the gray of the one he was in before because he didn't synapse in that one. But he will exit the gray of this one, a level up if we ascended, and then he will still go down the ventral ramus and then end up getting to wherever his effector ended up being. So all this is showing you is that it traveled one or two segments up, or maybe it traveled a segment or two down before it left. Okay, that's all that's really saying there. So that's why we said it might synapse in the first one, it might not. It might go up to a different level or down a level and decide to synapse in that one, and then finally exit. Another thing that can happen, let me add, if we have another ganglion, so let me, let's see if I can move that line over a little bit like that into that guy. Now another thing that can happen is we can have another exit here, and this time I am going in more in front towards the ventral side of my cord, and I could have another ganglion here, and that ganglion is going to be called the, where did I put your name? So to make things even more complicated, of course, right? In addition to this guy going up or down in a paravertebral ganglion and synapsing, he could travel to the paravertebral ganglion and not synapse, and then he could actually go to a collateral branch, which comes off and either ascend or descend up or down the next paravertebral ganglion. Off-ramp is still the same. And here we are. Prevertebral is in front. So this guy was paravertebral over here, and I'm going to put this in blue over here. This guy here is a prevertebral, pre because he's in front of the spinal cord, para because he was off to the side. So this is a prevertebral ganglion. And this area between the para to the prevertebral is called a splanchnic nerve. So splanchnic was just sympathetic, right? Because the pelvic splanchnic was parasympathetic. This is sympathetic that we're talking about. And that would be the splanchnic, I cannot say this word for the life of me today, splanchnic nerve between paravertebral ganglion to the prevertebral ganglion. Okay, and another name for prevertebral ganglion is the collateral ganglia. And these are part of the sympathetic ganglia. Okay, So I'm going to leave this picture here for a second. I want you guys to see this other set of notes, and then you can come back to it. So this red nerve could have, let me do like a different one. Let's do like out of colors. Let's do this blue here. So let's say instead you had a different neuron in the lateral horn, and maybe he came out here. Which side do we go in? Always the white, never the gray. So in on white. Let's say he decides not to synapse in the paravertebral ganglion, and he doesn't need to go up or down in a paravertebral ganglion. Maybe he goes straight over to the prevertebral ganglia where he would synapse. And then from there, that guy could then go wherever he's going to his effector. Okay, splanchnic means visceral. So he's probably going to one of the visceral organs at that point. Okay, so, all right. So if we break this down, for afferent is the same for all of these guys, right? So if we look at whether it goes in and synapses in the first postganglionic or first paravertebral ganglion, or whether it passes through it and does not and goes to a different one, like ascends or descends, or whether the pathway wants to synapse in the prevertebral ganglion. They all come in the same way. It just depends where do they travel within, and I know it's complicated, but draw the simple picture first, talk your way through it, add to your picture then, decide whether you're going to go up or down, add to your picture again, use different colors to help keep straight which lines you have going where. And about the third time you've drawn this, it'll get faster when you're trying to draw the picture. Okay, so let's see, where are we at now? What else do I want to tell you? You could actually have a lot of collateral axons coming off of the sympathetic preganglionic axon simultaneously, but we're not trying to make it super duper complicated on that one. We've already made it complicated enough, right? All right, so what do we want to say about the preganglionic one? Here you are. We did sacral outflow, we did preganglionic axon reaches paravertebral ganglion. There's several possibilities. We talked about it synapsing. What else do we want to say? You could draw the picture that they have there, but I think if you follow it, don't worry about how it came in right there. Think about what it's doing as it's exiting the spinal cord and how it synapses. So think about the motor side of it, the pre and post ganglionic neuron. Where do they synapse? Where do you find the cell bodies? And follow the pathway in that way. If it passes through without synapsing, so no synapse, then it's going to move to the from the paravertebral ganglion to the next paravertebral ganglion. So that was number 2 here. I should go back to black again. So it says pass through without synapsing. If so, then if so, if no synapsing in the paravertebral ganglion, we'll just put gang, and it runs through, then it could also end up at the prevertebral ganglion. You guys can see how complicated we are. All right, then we have pathways with the synapse in the paravertebral ganglion. We talked about the white ramus, so this is where it is just written out in your notes as far as white and gray rami. So the white and gray ramus communicans contains, for white, is the preganglionic axon only. For the gray, it's going to be the postganglionic axon, so that makes sense when you draw your axons in the previous picture, right? So white is always in, gray was always out, okay? Pathways with the synapse in the collateral ganglion, what they're talking about is the prevertebral there. Okay, and then remember when we were talking about thoracolumbar? Here we have the thoracic splanchnic nerve. So you guys already know that that has to be talking about what? Sympathetic, yeah. And then lumbar and sacral splanchnic. The lumbar part of it, you know for sure, we're still talking about sympathetic. If they're talking about pelvic splanchnic, we're talking about who? Parasympathetic, okay? So thoracic splanchnic nerves supply most of the abdominal viscera, excuse me, and then the lumbar and sacral splanchnic nerves serve distal or innervate the distal visceral organs. So that's like your sigmoid colon, the rectum, the bladder, that type of thing. And we're talking about sympathetic if it's lumbar, parasympathetic if it was the pelvic splanchnic. And let's see, what else? There is a special case, it says. Special case, some of these splanchnic endings stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So adrenal medulla, we're talking about your adrenal gland. Medulla means the more central region of the adrenal gland. And then epi and norepinephrine essentially is adrenaline, right? And so we will often release this when we have a strong sudden response. So somebody gets in a car accident and all of a sudden you flood your body with the adrenaline. And as soon, while the immediate stress is going on, you're probably not doing too bad, maybe you're a little shaky, but once the event is over, sometimes you're really still shaking, like you have all this adrenaline coursing through your body and it hasn't left yet because it's going to take some time for it to dissipate. So that's where sometimes this has kind of gone crazy. So when you're in flight or fight mode, and you have all of a sudden all of this adrenaline and or epinephrine and norepinephrine in your bloodstream. And if it's in your bloodstream, it's getting everywhere essentially, right? And which is kind of the point, you want it to get everywhere. So this, why if you are already in fight or flight mode, would you want to release even more at that moment? So you don't get tired. Maybe you might have to outrun that bear longer than you anticipated, right? And so basically the reason this is now getting released is to augment and extend the activity. So it's kind of like making you like that superhuman. You know, like when you hear about that mom or dad that all of a sudden lifted the vehicle off of the child, this is partly why this can happen. All of a sudden you are stronger, bigger, able to do something you would not normally be able to do, and you're in a very stressful situation, and this will augment it and help extend it a little bit longer. And it will last a little longer also because it's in the bloodstream. It's not a local event, it's going everywhere all of a sudden. So it's a dramatic response and it's long lasting. So that's your special case. As far as visceral sensory neurons, they follow the same pathways as the somatic sensory neurons. So that was just like our original drawing. And let's see, on our pictures here, so they have somatic on the left, they have autonomic on the right. What they're saying here on somatic, you have your sensory receptor right here. Information travels in, you know about the dorsal root ganglion. Notice how I've repeated myself like 5 million times on this stuff, and it doesn't matter if you hear me repeat it 5 million times, you guys need to repeat the same story over and over and over so it becomes like rote. So it goes up to your dorsal root ganglion, unipolar cell body resides there. It goes to your, which area? Which horn? Dorsal horn, where it will synapse either with an interneuron, and then for the motor neuron, which the motor neuron resides in the ventral horn because we're talking about somatic. And then he's going to travel out, and this is simple. This is basic reflex. It's somatic, not autonomic. So it goes right out to your effector. In this case, it has to be skeletal muscle. What is our neurotransmitter? ACH, acetylcholine. See all this stuff you guys already know because I've repeated myself a gazillion times? All right. So you use some of the basic stuff you already knew for that. Now apply it to autonomic. Same kind of thing. You have sensory receptors in your viscera, so the neuron sends the information up. Again, don't worry about where it's going in there, but it's still sensory, so where is it going to go? Where's the cell body we're talking about? Dorsal root ganglion, DRG, right? Unipolar still, all that's the same. Goes into the spinal cord, and where will it synapse? Because now we're talking about autonomic. We're going to go to the, so we're talking sympathetic. It's going to go to the lateral horn. So that's why it's hard to see on this picture, but he's technically on the lateral horn. And then if you keep it simple, he would exit maybe the first paravertebral ganglion. He would enter in on the white, he would exit on the gray, and he would come out the ventral root, or the ventral ramus, sorry, and then go to his effector. The effectors for autonomic are, no, not skeletal, it's smooth muscle, cardiac, gland. See, you guys are studying so good already for this stuff. Okay, if we want to make it more complicated, let's say he doesn't want to synapse with the second motor neuron in the paravertebral ganglion. Instead, he decides he's going to ascend or descend. He's going to go in the white, but not exit that one's gray. He's going to go to another paravertebral, and maybe he'll synapse in that one. He still exits that one's gray rami, and then down and the rest of the story was the same. Or he could be in the paravertebral, come in on the white, and he could decide that he wants to go down a splanchnic nerve and go to the prevertebral ganglion, and then exit from there and do all the other stuff that he wants to do. So all of that was right there on visceral sensory neurons. So we were talking about the motor before. Visceral, the way that the information comes in on the sensory is the same, no matter what we're talking about there, right? Keeping it simple, which is nice. Now, everybody always wants to know about referred pain, because everybody's probably experienced referred pain at some point. So referred pain is also called visceral pain, PN for pain. And so what it means is that you will sometimes have pain that does not seem like it's associated where it's actually coming from. Okay, it is not following a nerve pathway that you're aware of, so it doesn't make any sense to you. For example, if you had like a heart attack, it's not your heart that you notice is painful. What do people oftentimes describe for heart attack pain?
Chest pressure.
Chest pressure, their left wall chest pain, it may be left arm pain, maybe up the left neck into the left jaw. So those things, why is that associated with the heart? Those are referred pain symptoms. Okay, it's not the heart in those areas, right? Your heart's not down in your arm. Your heart's not down, up in your jaw. Okay, so let's put heart attack as an example, and we have left chest wall pain. We have left face, and we'll put UE for upper extremity pain, for example. Another example, other than the heart, that they're also showing you on here, let's say you had appendicitis. So they're showing your little tiny little appendix there is mad and angry at you and inflamed and irritated. So there are stretch receptors. So inflammation, it's kind of swelling up a little bit. A stretch receptor, it's sensory, right? It's sending the information, so that's why they're showing you the pathway going in. So, but the problem is you don't feel it that you know of at your appendix. You maybe feel it all over your tummy, right? All over the whole abdominal area. Maybe after a couple days it hones in and it becomes more right lower quadrant type pain. But initially it's kind of all over the place. So why do we have these referred symptoms? Anybody had kidney pain before? Where did it refer to? Back. Also, a lot of times gallbladder or kidney can refer to the right shoulder blade if it's the right kidney. Left kidney would refer to the left shoulder blade. Again, why is it going to these places? I'm glad you asked. Let me fill you in. So basically, it has to do with how you were forming embryonically, okay? So basically, you get perceived pain because of the autonomic afferents that are associated with your somatic afferents, okay? They run in the same pathway. So if someone tickles you, for example, in the inner part of your left arm, okay, and that pathway will arise from the same embryologic starting place. So the heart fibers and the nerve fibers, afferent autonomic nerve fibers, and the somatic afferent fibers that went to that area were running along the same pathway embryologically, which doesn't mean you had an arm yet there, okay? And then as you were developing and things start spreading out and going to other places, they start splitting off and going to other areas. Now, sometimes when this information is right next to each other, they start, you could kind of think of it like crosstalk, like the information is getting, not like crossing your wires, but it's kind of like information is kind of getting jumbled up there a little bit. So with appendicitis, the afferent fiber information is going in, so you had the stretch and the pressure going on. You send it to the DRG, just like we talked about before. It synapses in the dorsal horn, and it has the same pathway. Those nociceptors, the sensory receptors, had the same pathway, so afferent going up. Okay, so because they arise from the same embryologic starting place, so let me put this under autonomic afferents. So these guys run in same fiber pathways as the somatic afferents. Okay, and it's because, so B/C, because they're from the same embryological or original starting place. So it makes sense that you don't really realize or understand where the pain is coming from. So they originate right next to one another, okay? The somatic and the autonomic afferent fibers. Then as you develop, they start separating, moving to different pathways. And then whenever you feel visceral pain on your body, it's because that part of the body originated from that organ origination also. I know this sounds weird. The fibers are coming from the same area, then they split off. So when one thing got stimulated, now the other thing is getting stimulated. Also, it says autonomic pain. The brain has a hard time discriminating or differentiating between that type of pain. It's not like you cut your finger and you see your finger with your eyes. You're like, ow, that hurts. I can see the injury. Okay? Can you see why you're having the pain from your heart? Can you see the heart?
No.
No. Not, maybe if you had a bullet hole and it was big enough you could see the heart and you're like, wow, that sucks and I'm dead. But you can't see it, so you don't know. You don't have other special sense stimuli telling you what else is going on. So it's harder for your brain to project that image and understand it also. So brain doesn't discriminate autonomic. This pen is driving me nuts because it's not set up right on the screen. I apologize. So it does not discriminate autonomic pain well. And so you also don't have as many autonomic receptors, like, and we'll put no eyes because you can't see it then. So this is terrible. Autonomic receptors, like eyes, to tell you also what you're experiencing. So it starts at the same area, you get crosstalk, and with somatic nervous system, you have additional sensory receptors, which are complex sense organs like your eyes. So when you get hurt, you could look at it and you could see it, but you can't see your heart, so autonomic is limited with that additional input. So it's a kind of a combo of why the pain is so all over the place and doesn't hone in on one spot, and you have a hard time knowing you have appendicitis at first, or that your heart pain is actually from heart attack-like symptoms and stuff. So let's see. Ooh, all right. You guys want to fill out an eval on me today real quick?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so let's end the lecture here. We'll finish up with ANS physiology in the next class and complete all of the chapter 15 on Tuesday, and then you guys will have a whole week then to study for exam 5 material and exam 6. And let's